So with the consequentialist frameworks out of the way, let's move on to have a look at an alternative way of deciding whether an act is ethical or not by looking at how someone does the act, a deontological approach. So let's have a look at this example here. So here we have a scenario where there's a mispayment of $50,000. Okay. Now, I understand that we could approach this from a utilitarian point of view and look at who benefits, who gains, etc., to come to an action. But when we read these scenarios, right, where one involves fraud, when the other involves a mistake, that we kind of get this sense that these moral scenarios are not exactly the same, or a lot of people would actually think that, even if the consequences were the same. But even without thinking about the consequences, right, I think that there's a moral dimension to this comparison that maybe isn't captured by impact. It's captured more by the motivation of the actor, of the senior accountant here, right? In one, they're motivated to do the wrong thing, in the other, not so much. And that's what a deontological approach is about. It's about looking at how you do something rather than the consequence itself. So despite the outcome, the loss of $50,000 being similar in these situations, what we tend to find is that we worry about the intentions irrespective of the consequences involved. And so that means we need maybe a different way of thinking about ethical problems, a different theory. And we're going to have a look at the work of Immanuel Kant around here, who's one of the most well-known approaches to deontological ethics. So Kant is particularly interested in making sure that morality, right, equates across to being motivated by goodwill. So motivation is critical to what he's thinking about here. But, and this is really important, that's irrespective or regardless of the consequences. So Kant doesn't really care about what happens. He's worried about doing something because it's the right thing to do, not because it will lead to a good outcome. And in fact, he kind of flips this to say this means that we have a moral duty to do the right thing. And so that's one of the things to think about with Kant, that he sees this as a duty, that this is what we have to do, okay, rather than... And this is one of the things that we need to remember about Kant, is that he sees it as a duty for us to do, even if our actions result in bad consequences. He sees this, right, as irrelevant. Okay, so it's irrelevant what the consequences will be. Well, irrelevant in the sense of morality. Okay, it's obviously a bad consequence, but morally, it was the right thing to do. And so Kant's approach is deontological. It's this idea of a duty, right, or an obligation or rule to do the right thing, rather than worrying about the consequences as we have been today. Now, one of the most interesting things about Kant, well, at least from my perspective, is you've got to put him in place back in time, right? So if you go back to when he was around, how did we decide what was moral or what was ethical? And he predates the utilitarian approach, right? So what most people would do, particularly Europe and in the Anglo system, which is, you know, what we're concentrating on with this Australian ethics and law. So one of the things that we see is that the church had a great impact on society, and you would in essence do whatever the priest said. Okay, so the local priest would determine what's moral or ethical. Kant had a bit of a problem with this, and he actually thought, well, actually what separates us from humans is our ability to reason and think logically. So ethically, we should be able to work out what's the right thing to do, and that's what he did. He tried to come up with a set of rules that would determine whether something was ethical or not, and that took us away from this idea that we just have to rely on the advice of someone, whoever that is. In his case, around that particular time, it was the priest. But what he was really saying is humans are different. We're logical. We can work out what the right thing to do is. Okay, so that means we've got to have a look at his rules. So what did his rules say? The first thing to note is that his ideas are based upon the difference of humans being rational, to deliberate, follow rules, and make logical choices. So that means we should act consistently. So we shouldn't act in ways that are inconsistent or contradictory. Okay? And he also said we should act in a way that reinforces this rationality. So we shouldn't act in a way that denies our nature as rational beings. So he's saying as a rational beings, we have a moral duty to act consistently in line with a set of absolute principles. So Kant has some pretty big words in terms of his approach to theory. That comes both from the time when he was developing this theory, but also the way moral philosophers approach things, and having precision of language is important. So he in turn called this absolute duty the categorical imperative, right? So it was imperative, right, to follow the category of the good. So that's why it's a categorical imperative. And so it shouldn't vary with situations, this categorical imperative. Now, he had 3 formulations for them. We're going to deal with 2. Don't worry about the third, we're going to deal with 2. So formulation 1, universal acceptability. So if a rule or a maxim is ethical, then everyone should be able to do it all the time. So act according to a rule, a maxim or a rule. Act according to a rule whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So you should only do things in line with rules that everyone can do all the time. Okay? If not, we start to get inconsistency, right? Formulation 2, respect. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or the person of another. So treat everyone, he's just saying humanity, treat everyone always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. Okay, so don't use people. That's the essence. So these 2 things. We want to have consistent universal laws, universal acceptability, and those laws should respect people, not be a law that just simply uses someone.